Hi, fifth graders, back with The Thief of Always. I am going to be reading chapters 15, 16, and 17 today, and those are for session number 8. So make sure you listen to these chapters before that lesson. Chapter 15 is called New Nightmares. It was a more difficult tale to tell than he expected it to be. Though some of the details were clear in his head, Rictus's first appearance, the sinking of the ark, his and Wendell's escape, there was much else he could not properly remember. It was as though the mist he'd strode through had seeped into his head, and had there drawn a veil over the house and much of what it contained. I remember speaking to you on the phone 2 or 3 times, he said. You didn't speak to us, honey, his mom replied. Then that was just another trick, Harvey said. I should have known. But who is playing all those tricks? His father demanded. If this house exists, I say if, then whoever owns it kidnapped you and somehow kept you from growing up. Maybe he froze you. No, said Harvey. It was warm there, except when the snow came down, of course. There has to be some sane explanation. There is, said Harvey. It was magic. His father shook his head. That's a child's answer, he said, and I'm not a child anymore. And I know what I know, said Harvey firmly. It isn't very much, honey, his mom said. I wish I could remember more. She put a comforting arm around his shoulder. Never mind, she said. We'll talk about it when you've had a rest. Would you find this house again? His father asked him. Yes, Harvey replied, though his skin ran with chills at the thought of going back. I think so. Then that's what we'll do. I don't want him going back to that place, his mother said. We have to know it exists before we report it to the police. You understand that, don't you, son? Harvey nodded. It sounds like something I made up, I know, but it's not. I swear it's not. Come on, sweetie, his mother said. I'm afraid your room's changed a bit, but it's still comfortable. I kept it just as you'd left it for years and years, hoping you'd find your way home. Then I realized that if you ever did come back, you'd be a grown man, and you wouldn't want it decorated with rocket ships and parrots. So we had the decorators in. It's completely different now. I don't mind, Harvey said. It's home, and that's all I care about. In the early afternoon, as he slept in his old room, it rained. A hard March rain that beat against the windows and slapped on the sill. The sound woke him. He sat up in bed with the hairs on his nape pricking and knew that he'd been dreaming of Lulu. Poor lost Lulu, dragging her misshapen body through the bushes, her flipper hand catching the ark animals she'd dredged up from the mud. The thought of her unhappiness was unbearable. How could he ever hope to live in a world to which he'd returned, knowing that she remained Hood's prisoner? I'll find you, he murmured to himself. I will, I swear. Then he lay back on the cold pillow and listened to the sound of rain until sleep crept over him. Exhausted by his travels and traumas, he didn't wake until the following morning. The rain had cleared. It was time to lay plans. I bought a map of the whole Millsap, his father said, unfolding his purchase and spreading it over the kitchen table. There's our house. He had already marked the place with a cross. Now, do you remember any of the street names around Hood's place? Harvey shook his head. I was too busy escaping, he said. Were there any particular buildings you saw? It was dark and rainy, so we'll just have to trust luck. We'll find it, Harvey said, even if it takes all week. It was easier said than done. More than 3 decades had passed since he'd first made his way through the town with Rictus, and countless things had changed. There were new plazas and new slums, new cars on the streets and new aircraft overhead, so many distractions, all keeping Harvey from the trail. I don't know which way is which, he admitted after they'd been searching for half a day. Nothing's the way I remember it. We'll keep going, his father said. It'll all come clear. It didn't. They spent the rest of the day wandering around, hoping that some sight would trigger a memory, but it was a frustrating business. Every now and then, in some square or street, Harvey would say, maybe this is it, and they'd head off in one direction or another, only to find that the trail grew cold a few blocks on. That evening, his father quizzed him again. If you could only remember what the house looked like, he said, I could describe it to people. It was big, I remember that, and old. I'm sure it was very old. Could you draw it? I could try. He did just that, and though he wasn't much of an artist, his hands seemed to remember more than his brain had, because after half an hour he had drawn the house in considerable detail. His father was pleased. We'll take this with us tomorrow, he said. Maybe somebody will recognize it. But the second day was just as frustrating as the first. Nobody knew the house that Harvey had drawn, nor anything remotely like it. By the end of the afternoon, Harvey's father was getting short-tempered. It's useless, he said. I must have asked 500 people, and not one of them, not one, even vaguely recognized the place. It's not surprising, said Harvey. I don't think anyone who saw the house, besides me and Wendell, ever escaped before. We should just repeat all this to the police, his mother said, and let them deal with it. And what do we tell them? His father said, raising his voice. That we think there's a house out there that hides in a mist and steals children with magic? It's ridiculous. Calm down, Harvey's mother said. We'll talk about this after we've eaten. They trudged home, ate, and discussed the whole problem again, but without finding any solutions. Mr. Hood had laid his traps carefully over the years, protecting himself from the laws of the real world. Safe behind the mists of his illusions, he'd most likely already found 2 new and unwitting prisoners to replace Harvey and Wendell. It seemed this evil would go on, undiscovered and unpunished. The following day, Harvey's father made an announcement. This search is getting us nowhere, he said. We're going to give it up. Are you going to the police? His wife asked him. Yes, and they'll want Harvey to tell them everything he knows. It's going to be difficult, son. They won't believe me, Harvey said. That's why I'm going to talk to them first, his father said. I'll find somebody who'll listen. He left soon after breakfast with a worried expression on his face. This is all my fault, Harvey said to his mom. We lost all that time together, just because I was bored. Don't blame yourself, she said. We're all tempted to do things we regret once in a while. Sometimes we choose badly and make mistakes. I just wish I knew how to unmake it, Harvey replied. His mother went out shopping in the middle of the morning and left Harvey haunted by that thought. Was there some way to undo the damage that had been done, to take back the stolen years and live them here with the people who loved him and whom he loved dearly in return? He was sitting at his bedroom window trying to puzzle the problem out when he saw a forlorn figure at the street corner. He threw open the window and yelled down to him, Wendell, over here! Then he raced downstairs. By the time he opened the door, his friend was on the step, his face red and wet with tears and sweat. What happened? He said. Everything's changed. His words were punctuated by hiccups. My dad divorced my mom, and my mom's so old, Harvey, and fat as a house. He wiped his running nose with the back of his hand and sniffed hard. It wasn't supposed to be this way, he said. Well, was it? Harvey did his best to explain how the house had deceived them, but Wendell was in no mood for theory. He just wanted the nightmare to be over. I want things the way they were, he wailed. My dad's gone to the police, Harvey said. He's going to tell them everything. That won't do any good, Wendell said despairingly. They'll never find the house. You're right, Harvey said. I went to look for it with my mom and dad, but it was no use. It's hiding. Well, it's bound to hide from them, stupid, Wendell said. It doesn't want grown-ups. You're right, said Harvey. It wants children, and I bet it wants you and me more than ever. How do you reckon that? It almost had us. It almost ate us alive. So you think it got a taste for us? I'm sure of it. Wendell stared at his feet for a moment. You think we should go back, don't you? I don't think any of those grown-ups, my dad, your mom, the police, are ever going to find the house. If we want all those years back, we have to get them for ourselves. I don't much like the idea, Wendell confessed. Neither do I, he said, thinking as he spoke that he'd have to leave a note for his mom and dad, so they wouldn't think his return had been a dream. We have to go, he said. We don't have any choice. So when do we start? Now, said Harvey grimly. We've lost too much time already. Chapter 16. Back to the Happy Land. It was as if the house knew that they were coming back and was calling to them. As soon as they stepped out into the street, their feet seemed to know the way. All they had to do was let them lead. What do we do when we get there? Wendell wanted to know. I mean, we only just escaped with our lives last time. Mrs. Griffin will help us, Harvey said. Wendell's breath quickened. Suppose Karna bit her head off, he said. Then we'll have to do it alone. Do what? Find Hood. But you told me he was dead. I don't think being dead means much to a creature like him, Harvey said. He's in the house somewhere, Wendell, and we have to hunt him down, whether we like it or not. He's the one who stole all those years with our moms and dads, and we won't get them back until we face him. You make it sound easy, Wendell said. The whole house is a box of tricks, Harvey reminded him. The seasons, the presents, they're all illusions. We have to hold on to that. Harvey, look. Wendell pointed ahead of them. Harvey knew the street at a glance. 33 days ago, he'd stood here with Rictus and listened to the tempter tell him what a fine place lay on the other side of the mist wall up ahead. This is it then, Harvey said. It was strange, but he didn't feel afraid, even though he knew they were walking back into their enemy's arms. It was better to face Hood and his illusions now than to spend the rest of his life wondering about Lulu and mourning the years he'd lost. Are you ready? He asked Wendell. Before we go, his friend replied, can we get just one thing straight? If the house is all illusions, then how come we felt the cold? How come I got fat from eating Mrs. Griffin's pies? And I don't know, Harvey cut in, without running a cold finger up his spine. I can't explain how Hood's magic works. All I know is he took all those years away to feed himself. Feed? Yeah, like a vampire. This was the first time Harvey had thought of Hood that way, but it instinctively seemed right. Blood was life, and life was what Hood fed on. He was a vampire, sure enough, maybe a king among vampires. So shouldn't we have a steak or holy water or something? That's just in stories, Harvey said. But if he comes after us, we fight. Fight with what? Harvey shrugged. The truth was, he didn't know, but he was sure that crosses and prayers weren't going to be any use in the battle that lay ahead. No more talk, he said to Wendell. If you don't want to come, then don't. I didn't say that. Good, said Harvey, and he started toward the mist. Wendell followed on his heels, and just as Harvey stepped into the wall, he snatched hold of his friend's sleeve so that as they entered, as they had exited, together, the mist closed around them like a waterlogged blanket. Pressing so hard against their faces, Harvey half thought it intended to smother them, but it only wished to keep them from changing their minds. A moment later, a tremor moved through its folds and spat them out on the other side. It was high summer in Hood's kingdom, the lazy season. The sun, which had been hidden by rain clouds on the other side of the mist, was beaming down on the house and all that prospered around it. The trees swayed in the balmy breeze. The doors and windows of the house, its porch and chimneys, all gleamed as if newly painted. There were welcoming signs in the eaves, welcoming smells from the kitchen, welcoming laughter through the open door. Welcome, everywhere, welcome. I'd forgotten, Wendell murmured. Forgotten what? How beautiful it is. Don't trust it, Harvey said. It's all illusion, remember, all of it. Wendell didn't reply, but wandered away toward the trees. The honeyed breeze gusted around him, and as if to pluck him up, he didn't resist, but went where it led, into the dappled shade. Wendell, Harvey said, following him across the lawn, we've got to stick together. I had forgotten about the tree house, Wendell said dreamily, staring up into the canopy. We had such fun up there, remember? No, said Harvey, determined not to let the past distract him from his mission here. I don't remember. Yes, you do, said Wendell, smiling from ear to ear. We worked so hard up there. I'm going up to see how it looks. Harvey gripped his arm. No, you're not. Yes, I am, he snapped back, wrenching his arm from Harvey's grip. I can do whatever I want. You don't own me. Harvey could see by the glazed look in Wendell's eyes that the house was already working its seductive magic. It could only be a matter of time, he knew, before his own powers of resistance were worn away. And what then? Would he forget his work here entirely and become an empty-headed boy, laughing like a loon while his soul was sucked away? No, he said aloud. I'm not going to let you do it. Do what? Said Wendell. We've got work to do, Harvey told him. Who cares? Wendell replied. I do, and so did you 5 minutes ago. Remember what it did to us, Wendell? The wind in the trees seemed to sigh at this. Ah, it said, as if it now understood Harvey's purpose here and would waft this intelligence to the ears of Mr. Hood. Harvey didn't care, in fact. He was pleased. Go on, he said, as the gusts flew toward the house. Tell him, tell him. He turned on Wendell. Are you coming, he said, or am I going to go in alone? I don't mind going in, Wendell said cheerily. I'm hungry. Harvey stared hard at Wendell. Don't you remember anything we said out there? He demanded. Of course I do, Wendell replied. We said we were going to... He paused, frowning. Going to... This place had stolen time that belonged to us, Wendell. How did it do that? Said Wendell, still frowning deeply. It's just... Again he faltered, searching for the words. Just a perfect day. The frown began to fade away, and a broad smile replaced it. Who cares? Wendell said. I mean, on a day like this, who cares? Let's just enjoy ourselves. Harvey shook his head. He was losing precious time here, which was exactly what Hood and the house wanted. Instead of wasting any further words on Wendell, he turned on his heel and headed toward the front door. Wait for me, Wendell hollered. Can you smell that pie? Harvey could, and wished he'd put some food in his belly before he'd started out on this adventure. Knowing that these tantalizing smells were all part of Hood's repertoire wasn't enough to stop his mouth from watering or his stomach from grumbling. All he could do was think of the dust to which his ark animals had turned when he'd stepped out into the street. The pie on the kitchen table was probably made of the same bitter stuff, concealed beneath a veneer of sweetness. He held on to that thought as best he could, knowing that the house into which he was about to step would be full of such blandishments. With Wendell again trailing a step behind, he climbed the porch steps and marched into the house. The moment they were both inside, the door slammed behind them. Harvey reeled around, his skin crawling. It was not the wind that had thrown the door shut. It was Rictus. Chapter 17. Cook, Cat, and Coffin. Great to have you back, boy, Rictus said, his smile as wide as ever. I told everyone you wouldn't be able to stay away. Nobody believed me. He's gone, they said. He's gone. But I knew better. He started to wander toward Harvey. I knew you wouldn't be satisfied with a little visit. That was so much fun still to be had. I'm hungry, Wendell whined. Help yourselves, Rictus grinned. Wendell was off at a sprint into the kitchen. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, he hollered. Look at all this food. Harvey didn't reply. Aren't you hungry? Rictus said, raising an eyebrow high above his spectacles. He cupped his hand behind his ear. That sounds like an empty belly to me. Where's Mrs. Griffin? Harvey said. Oh, she's around, Rictus said mischievously, but she's getting old. She takes to her bed a good deal these days, so we laid her down somewhere safe and sound. As he spoke, there was a mewing sound from the living room, and there at the door stood Stew Cat. Rictus scowled. Get out of here, pussy, he spat. Can't you see we're having a conversation? But Stew Cat wasn't about to be intimidated. He sauntered over to Harvey, rubbing herself against his legs. What do you want? Harvey said, going down on his haunches to stroke her. She purred loudly. Hey, that's fine and dandy, Rictus said, putting off his anger in favor of a freshly polished smile. You like the cat? The cat likes you. Everybody's happy. I'm not happy, Harvey said. And why is that? I left all my presents here, and I don't know where. No problem, said Rictus. I'll find them for you. Would you do that? Harvey said. Sure, kid, said Rictus, persuaded that his charm was working again. That's what we're all here for, to give you whatever your heart desires. I think maybe I left them up in my bedroom, Harvey suggested. You know, I think I saw him up there, Rictus replied. You stay right here. I'll be back. He took himself up the stairs 2 and 3 at a time, whistling tunelessly through his teeth as he ascended. Harvey waited until he disappeared from sight, and then went to check on Wendell, letting Stew Cat slip away. Ah, now look at this, a voice said as he appeared at the kitchen door. It was Jive. He was standing at the stove, as sinewy as ever, juggling eggs with one hand and tossing pancakes in the pan with the other. What do you fancy? He said. Sweet or savory? Nothing, Harvey said. It's all good, Wendell piped up. He was almost hidden behind a wall of filled plates. Try the apple turnovers. They're great. Harvey was sorely tempted. The buffet looked wonderfully tempting, but it was dust. He had to keep remembering that. Maybe later, he said, averting his eyes from the heaps of syrup-drenched waffles and bowls of ice cream. Where are you going? Jive wanted to know. Mr. Rictus is finding a few presents for me, Harvey said. Jive smiled with satisfaction. So you're getting back into the swing of things, kiddo, he said. Good for you. I'd miss being here, Harvey replied. He didn't linger, just in case Jive saw the lie in his eyes, but turned and headed back into the hallway. Stew Cat was still there, staring at him. What is it? He said. The cat took off toward the stairs, then stopped and cast a backward glance. Have you something to show me? Harvey whispered. At this, the cat bounded off again. Harvey followed, expecting her to lead the way upstairs. But before she reached the bottom step, she veered off to her left and led Harvey down a narrow passage to a door he had never even noticed before. He rattled the handle, but the door was locked. Turning to look for Stew Cat, he found her rubbing her arched back against the leg of a small table set nearby. On the table was a carved wooden box. In the box was a key. He went back to the door, unlocked it, and pulled it open. There was a flight of wooden steps in front of him, leading down into the darkness from which a sour, dank smell rose. He might have been declined to descend had Stew Cat not hurried on past him, down into the murk. With his fingers trailing on the damp walls to the left and right of him, he followed Stew Cat to the bottom of the flight, counting the steps as he went. There were 52, and by the time he had descended them, all his eyes had become reasonably accustomed to the gloom. The cellar was cavernous but empty, except for a litter of rubble and a large wooden box, which lay in the dust maybe a dozen yards from where he stood. "What is it?" he hissed to Spook Cat, knowing the creature had no way of replying, but hoping for some sign nevertheless. Spook Cat's only answer was to run across the floor and leap nimbly up onto the box, where it began to claw at the wood. Harvey's curiosity was stronger than his fear, but not so much stronger that he dashed to pull off the lid. He approached as though the box were some sleeping beast, for all he knew it was. The closer he got, the more it resembled a crude coffin. But what kind of coffin was sealed with a padlock? Was this where Karna had been laid, perhaps after the beast had dragged its wounded body back home? Was it even now listening to Spook Cat scratch on the lid, waiting for release? As he came within a yard of the casket, however, he laid eyes on a clue to its contents, an apron string left hanging out of the box by whomever had locked it. He knew of only one person in the house who wore an apron. "Mrs. Griffin?" he whispered, digging his fingernails under the lid. "Mrs. Griffin, are you in there?" There was a muffled thump from inside. "I'm going to get you out," he promised, hauling on the lid as hard as he could. He didn't have the strength to break the lock. In desperation, he began to search the cellar, looking for some tool or other, and found himself 2 sizable rocks. Hefting them, he returned to the casket. "This is going to be noisy," he warned Mrs. Griffin. Then, using one stone as a kind of chisel and the other as a hammer, he assaulted the lock. Blue sparks flew as he struck at the metal, but he seemed to be making no impression until, all of a sudden, the lock gave a loud crack and fell to the ground. He paused for a moment, a feather of doubt brushing his brow. Suppose it was Karna's coffin? Then he threw the rocks aside and hauled off the lid. And that is the end of chapter 17. See you next time, 5th graders.